Hello all, let us now look at Gothic art in France. Our objectives as usual are acquire the basic vocabulary, concepts and criteria for understanding, interpreting and analyzing Gothic art, encounter significant works of the period and enable them to study later works influenced by this period. Understand and appreciate the role of values, beliefs and ideas in shaping the art of the times. In this chapter, we focus on Gothic art in France and look at the following. After introducing the chapter, we will look at French Gothic styles and representative examples of the art style. Saint Denis Church, Chartres Cathedral, Reims Cathedral and Reliquary Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, Paris. We will also look at how Gothic architecture was disseminated. Gothic style emerged in France when Capetian monarchy, Louis VII, 1137 to 1180, and Philip Augustus, 1180 and 1223, became powerful in France. It was Louis VII's queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, brought southwestern France into the royal domain. But when their marriage was annulled, Eleanor reclaimed her lands and married Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, who became Henry II of England. The resulting tangle of conflicting claims kept France and England at odds for centuries. French kings continued to consolidate royal authority and initiated a building boom to increase their domains and privileges. In the centralized city of Paris, a once traditional provincial town but now thriving urban center beginning in the middle of the 12th century. The exact date of Gothic art is 1137 to 1144. In Île-de-France, the region is northern France that was the personal domain of French royal family. It is Abbot Suger who is credited for the invention of Gothic. The Saint Denis, the Carolingian church, above 6 miles north of Paris, Suger searched for a new kind of architecture to reinforce the divine light of king's authority and enhance the spirituality of his church. Let us now look at French Gothic style. The designations of style in French Gothic architectures are as follows. Early Gothic. This style began in 1040 and was characterized by the adoption of the pointed arch and transition from late Romanesque architecture. To heighten the wall, builders divided it into 4 tiers: arcade, arches and piers, gallery, triforium and clerestory. To support the higher wall, builders invented the flying buttresses, which reached maturity only at High Gothic during the 13th century. The walls were 6-reeved, sexparieted walls, High Gothic. The 13th century style canonized proportions and shapes from early Gothic and developed them further to achieve light yet tall and majestic structures. The wall elevation was modified from 4 to only 3 tiers: arcade, triforium and clerestory. Pious coronations were smaller to avoid stopping the visual upward thrust. The clerestory windows changed from one window in each segment, hole in the wall, to 2 windows united by a small rose window. The rib vault changed from 6 to 4 ribs. The flying buttresses matured, and after they were embraced at Notre Dame de Paris, the Notre Dame de Chartres, they became the canonical way of support high walls, as they served both structural and ornamental purposes. Rayonnant. The word rayonnant is derived from the radiating spokes, like those of a wheel, of the enormous rose windows that are one of the features of the style. Height was no longer the prime objective. Rather, the architects further reduced the masonry frame of the churches, expanded the windows areas, and replaced the external wall of the triforium with traceried glass. Instead of the massive effects of the high Gothic cathedrals, both the interior and the exterior of the typical Rayonnant church now more nearly assumed the character of a diaphanous shade. Let us look at St. Denis Church. Suger studied the biblical account of the construction of Solomon's temple and immersed himself in what he thought were the writings of St. Denis, attributed erroneously to a follower of St. Paul named Dionysius, the Greek form of Denis, who considered radiant light a physical manifestation of God. Suger was inspired by the author's emphasis on the mathematical harmony that should exist between the parts of a building on a miraculous mystical effect of life. This was elaborated into a theory based on musical ratios. The result was a system that expressed complex symbolism based on mathematical ratios. In his construction of the church, Suger arranged the elements of medieval architecture to express the relationship between light and God's presence in a distinctive way. None of the individual architectural devices that Suger and his builders used was new. It was the way in which he synthesized elements of existing styles that was revolutionary. Suger invited an international team of masons, sculptors, metal workers, and glass painters, making this building site a major center of artistic exchange. Suger's additions to St. Denis consisted of a new narthex and west facade with twin towers and 3 portals. Inside, Suger retained the basic elements of Romanesque pilgrimage choir. A semicircular ambulatory in the apse permitted the public to circulate freely, while the clergy remained the radiating chapels. The arrangement of the chapels is a formal echo of the ambulatory, which creates a new sense of architectural unity. Suger's Shevet, the east end of the church, comprising the choir, ambulatory and apse, also emphasized the integration of the light with the lightness, because the entire area was covered with ribbed vaults. Supported by pointed arches, the Romanesque builders, in contrast, had restricted the lighter vaulting to the ambulatory. The arches, in turn, were supported by slender columns, which further enhanced the impression of lightness. On the exterior, thin buttresses were placed between the chapels to strengthen the walls. Let us look at some images of the church. Let us move to Chartres Cathedral. The construction of a cathedral was the largest single economic enterprise of the Gothic era. It had a significant effect on neighboring communities as well as on the city or town itself. Jobs were created for hundreds of masons, carpenters, sculptors, stonecutters and other craftsmen. When a cathedral was finished, it attracted thousands of pilgrims and other visitors, and this continual traffic stimulated the local economy. Cathedrals also provided a focus for community activities, secular as well as religious. Above all, they generated an enormous sense of civic pride among the townspeople. The cult of the Virgin Mary expanded during the Gothic period. Most of the great French cathedrals were dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady, the Virgin. To avoid confusion, therefore, it is customary to refer to the cathedrals by the towns in which they were located. At Chartres, the importance of Mary's cult was reinforced by the tradition that a pagan statue of a virgin and child worshipped in a nearby cave had prefigured the coming of Jesus and virgin birth. The cathedral combines the best preserved early Gothic architecture with high Gothic, as well as demonstrating the transitional developments in between. Work on the cathedral started in 1194 and was mostly completed in 1220. It emphasizes strong vertical lines in its structure. The stained glass windows that are used in the cathedral, it has 176, are recognized as the finest example from the Gothic style. Today, 94% of the stained glass is original, and it is the largest, most extensive collection of medieval glass in the world. Rows, windows were used. The primary subject of the great roses is the Virgin and the Child. The rose windows created wholeness and completeness. Indeed, it has a special relationship to the Virgin Mary in that it portrayed more realistic and humane qualities of the Virgin Mary. The cathedral reflects the strong influence that God held over the people at that time. It shows an expression of pity and local identity to those that were proud to live in the vicinity of the cathedral itself. It enhanced civic pride and was focus of the town itself. And now to Reims Cathedral. The High Gothic period inaugurated at Chartres culminates in the Cathedral of Reims, began 1210. Rather cold and overpowering in its perfectly balanced proportions, Reims represents the classical movement of serenity and repose in the evolution of Gothic cathedrals. Barred tracery, that characteristic feature of later Gothic architecture, was an invention of the first architect of Reims. In earlier plate tracery, as an clerestory of Chartres, a solid masonry wall is pierced by a series of openings. In barred tracery, however, a single window is subdivided into two or more lancets by means of long, thin monoliths known as mullions. The head of the window is filled with a tracery design that has the effect of cutout. Let us look at some more images of the cathedrals. Let us now turn to reliquary chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, Paris. The transcendent quality of Gothic light is nowhere more evident than in the reliquary chapel of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Commissioned by King Louis IX, the monument epitomizes the Renaissance style. Here, the walls literally become glass as the stone supports diminish. There is no transept, and this allows the tall, thin colonnades to rise uninterrupted from a short, dimly fit first story. The space was filled with a luminous darkness, vibrant with radiance of the windows. The dominant colors were a dark saturated blue and a brilliant ruby red. Small stained glass medallions illustrating episodes from the Bible and from the lives of the saints were reserved for the windows of the chapels and the side easels. Their closeness to the observer made their details easily distinguishable. Each of the lofty windows of the clerestory, on the other hand, was occupied by single monumental figures. Because of their often colossal size, they were also readily visible from below. Let us look at some more images of the monument. Let us now see how French Gothic architecture disseminated. The influence of French Gothic architecture on much of rest of Europe was profound. In France, the scheme of Bourgeois, with its giant arcade and short clerestory, met with little response. But in Spain it was taken up again and again. Beginning in 1221 with the Cathedral of Toledo and continuing into the early 14th century with the cathedrals of Palma de Mallorca, Barcelona and Girona. In Germany, the impact of all phases of French Gothic architecture was decisive. From the early Gothic 4-story elevation of the Cathedral of the Limburg Ganderlehen 1225 to the choir of Cologne Cathedral began 1248, modelled on choir of Amiens, and the interior of Cologne exceeds in height even that of Beauvais. Italy and England, however, are the exceptions to this pervasive French influence. The peculiarly Italianate idiom of Gothic churches of Florence and the superficial reminiscences of the French Gothic facades on the Cathedral of Siena and Orvieto are but transitory phases in a development that leads from the Italian Romanesque to Filippo Brunelleschi and the beginnings of the Renaissance. In England, French Gothic architecture intruded itself only twice. Once in the 1070s in the eastern extension of Canterbury Cathedral, and again in Henry III's Westminster Abbey, begun 1245, patterned on the general scheme of Reims, with Parisian renowned modifications. Otherwise, the English architects developed their own highly successful Gothic idiom, rejecting the aspiring verticality and the functional logic of the French cathedrals. The English churches emphasize length and horizontality, replacing the French polygonal apse with a square east end that is sometimes further prolonged by a rectangular Lady Chapel, a chapel devoted to the Virgin Mary, characteristic of English cathedrals. This extreme elongation often includes two separate transepts. The multiplication in the number of ribs, some of which are purely ornamental nature, is also characteristically English. The first major phase of this insular architecture, the early English period, is well represented, except for the 15th century tower and spire, by the Cathedral of Salisbury, began 1220. The introduction of the bar tracery in Westminster Abbey led to an astonishing variety of tracery design. This decorated period, with its lavish ornamentation, also produced such poetic creations as the lovely Angel Choir, begun 1256 in Lincoln Cathedral. It was responsible as well for that unique masterpiece of medieval architecture. The astounding octagon, begun 1322 of LA Cathedral, with its wooden lantern and tower soaring over the crossing.